It's so great to see familiar faces and new faces every year. This is our 10th year for the Marches program. 10th year, yay! Yeah, and this has become my community. And so you are all my brothers and sisters, and it's so good to see you. And those of you who are new this year, welcome. And I hope to see you next year too. So now this morning we are going to talk about sin. And I'm actually happy about the turnout, because usually when we talk about sin, we don't have a good turnout. Because it's not a fun topic to talk about. And so I always want to emphasize that sin, the week of sin, first week of sin, comes after the principle and foundation. And that's extremely important, because we cannot look at sin without already knowing that we are beloved. Because if we don't know we are beloved, then looking at sin becomes condemnation versus liberation. It becomes shaming and blaming, and like we want to hide, versus, oh God, help me to see how I need to change. And so like Father said, it's about reforming. It's about changing. It's about transformation. So it's not about condemnation. It's always about transformation. And so looking at the sin, social sin, this morning, the topic is sin in the world. When we found out that the speaker wasn't going to make it, and I thought, oh, okay, I already did this topic 2013. I'll just look at my notes, and I'll just do that. It would take me, I don't know, 20 minutes. And I look at my notes, and I didn't like it. So I guess I have grown the past 6 years, so this is a whole new presentation. And it's still changing this morning, so let's see what I end up having by the end of this talk. But sin in the world is really becoming aware of the social forces and the forces that prevent us from building the kingdom of God. That's really about, the social sin is about whatever is stopping us from building the kingdom of God. Whatever is stopping us from loving. And the reason why, when I thought about this, so I have a social work background. And for those of you who actually don't know, I used to be a union organizer and a community organizer. And then I ended up being a therapist. And the reason being that as I reflected on Jesus, if you think about Jesus, the world that Jesus lived in, it was a horrible world. It was a world, talking about social sin, it was a horrible world when the strong took advantage of the weak, when women were nothing, when children were nothing. And guess what they did for entertainment? Watching people killing people. Gladiators. That was the world Jesus lived in. And guess what happened to the Jews at that time? They were governed by the Romans. So did Jesus talk about politics? Did Jesus say, I'm going to overturn the government? I'm going to do all these things? And actually that's why Judith was upset, because they were hoping for some kind of political power. But as I reflected on that, I realized that what Jesus did was even more influential, which is, instead of just overturning the structure, Jesus changed hearts. That is the key to social sin. Yes, we have to overturn the structure, but we overturn the structure out of love. We overturn the structure from a changed heart. Because what I've learned is, without a changed heart, we go back and we build the same structure. And so what Jesus invited us to do, really two things. Love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And love others as yourself. That. And so when Father said, how do we do this? It's very challenging to do that in a world that's filled with forces that are against that, especially in the culture that we live in. The culture, like Father said, culture is against, a lot of times against the Christian values. And I think that's the remarkable thing about Christianity, about what Jesus taught, because what Jesus taught transformed the world. So that's, but first I want to talk about the dynamics that contribute to social sin. What kind of dynamics contribute to social sin? Well, one of the dynamic is called groupthink. Groupthink. Groupthing. Groupthink. What is groupthink? Groupthink is when we are in a group, we go with the loudest and the strongest, and we give up our voices. And so, if you think about the evil that's done in the world, Hitler did not single-handedly kill 6 million Jews. He had a lot of help. And where did the help come from? A lot of people. What happened with groupthink is that oftentimes when under pressure, we lose our voice. And that doesn't even happen in the society. I think it happens even in relationships, right? Husband and wife. If you know the other person is going to get mad, you zip. The same thing in companies, committees, meetings, with your boss. If you know that somebody is going to get mad at you, if we know that it's going to hurt our jobs, it's going to hurt our security, we zip. And so groupthink, the tendency for us to stay quiet and to lose our voice, is one of the important forces that contribute to social sin. Because when bad things are happening, what do? It requires a lot of courage for us to be able to stand up. And usually people who stand up, what happened historically to people who stood up? They get shot. Gone. However, they are like lightning rods, but it's those kind of people that help us to continue. So for women who are able to sit here today and being able to work for jobs, there were a lot of women who paved the way with a lot of discrimination, facing discrimination. And so being able to stand up against groupthink is quite a challenge. The second thing that contribute to social sin is really all these dynamics actually go all the way to individuals. Hurt people, hurt people. Hurt people, hurt people. So if people are hurt, and this is what we are discovering through trauma, in terms of bullying, in terms of violence, is that people who inflict violence, I guarantee you, they have a history of not having been loved well. They have not been loved well, and they have not been raised well. Because when a person who is loved well, they develop empathy. It's very, very difficult for them to hurt other people. And when you put somebody who has been hurt and give them the power of being a president, or your power of being a leader, power of being a company CEO, then you have somebody who has a lot of power to do a lot of hurt. And so hurt people in the sense that, oftentimes when we are hurt, what happens is the anger, the mistreatment, the resentment, it gets projected to somebody else. So then there's an enemy outside. So instead of in real relationship, oftentimes when I work with couples, that shows up too. When couples come in and they want to get a divorce or they're already in trouble a lot, they say it's his fault, it's her fault, it's his fault, it's her fault, and just goes back and forth. Well, you say this, but you say that, but you did that. Oh, you did that. So there was like circling back and forth. People continue to blame the other people, and the reason being that we see how people hurt us. But we actually don't necessarily see our reactions, our own contribution to the cycle. And so for the work, oftentimes even in psychotherapy, we talk about when you focus too much on other people, you are not focusing enough on yourself. Meaning, when you are focusing too much on what other people do, it's usually that you are not focusing enough on what you do and how you contribute. And that's why Jesus said, look at yourself first and don't throw the first stone. And so this applies to the example of 9/11. Apply examples of when we blame other countries for doing something wrong against us. The question is, why, right? Why did they do that? Do they just wake up one day and say, we hate the United States, and we are going to attack the United States and kill people there? Why? And so the question of why is very important because it asks the question of what role, how do we contribute to the cycle of violence? How does the United States contribute to the cycle of violence? How do I contribute to a bad relationship? What is my role? What is my society's role? the ability to self-reflect versus project, and project the blame, project the problems to somebody else, and then we can be self-righteous about hurting the other people too. And so that's this collective tendency to project fear and also to hurt others because we are hurt is another force that can contribute to social sin. And another thing is our sense, our tendency to think that to take care of ourselves. You know, the world says that the principle is the survival of the fittest, right? The survival of the fittest means if you are stronger, you are better, you deserve more, and you should survive. But that's not a Christian principle. Christian principle says, no, we need to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. But we tend to want to do things for ourselves. We want to take care of ourselves. We are afraid of not having security. And so the self-interest is understandable. But the problem is that when we focus too much on ourselves, we don't think about the gifts from God, the gift from others. I think it's very interesting in the United States, we talk about freedom. And oftentimes people say, oh, those people who are poor because they don't work hard enough. Right, you've all heard of that. People who are poor. If people who are poor, it's because they don't work hard enough. Now, what's wrong with that statement? There's some truth to that statement. But what's wrong with the statement is that we do not look at the systemic problems, how the structure makes it difficult for some people, even if they work very hard, they still cannot get ahead. There are forces. There are forces that are created by systems. There are rules that are created by systems that make it very difficult for some people to get ahead, so some people to move forward. So let me give you a few examples. Since I came from another country, so I noticed some things. So in the United States, schools, you know how the schools are funded in the United States? Property taxes. And so what does it mean, property taxes? Means that schools in Ladue will have very different amount of resource versus school in the city, in St. Louis City. And that's why in St. Louis, they ask people, where did you go to high school? What we don't know is actually that's a socio-economic question. Where did you go to high school? It means they rank your class. You are middle class, or you are working class, or you are upper middle class. Where did you go? And so schools have very different level of resource. And so if you grow up in a school where you get iPad, you get computers, you get the best paying teachers who are happy with their salaries, you get education, you go ahead. But then if you grow up already poor in areas where there's not a lot of money and you don't have school, I have a friend who teaches in a city school, and every year in the fall she would try to ask money to contribute, donate to supplies for the students. And so those kind of situations will make it even more difficult for some people to get ahead. So it is not true that if you work hard enough, you can get ahead, because there are a lot of forces that go against that. And sometimes there could be internalized, forces that go against that. Another example I want to give about how the system can be difficult. I'm sure you guys don't know what crack is. Crack versus cocaine. So cocaine and crack are the same thing. I teach social work, so I know a lot of these things. Crack and cocaine, they are the same thing. Crack is basically rock form of cocaine. Cocaine is powder. Crack is rock. It's much, much cheaper than cocaine. So cocaine is very expensive. I have a student who told me that when he had used cocaine, it cost about $500 a week to smoke cocaine. Now, rock is very cheap, much cheaper. It's another form of cocaine. And so guess who uses powder cocaine and who uses rock? So the poor people, and mostly the impoverished, because of lack of employment, because of stresses, they use rock cocaine. The rich uses the powder cocaine. And so 1986, there was a law, mandatory incarceration, is that if you are found in possession of 5 grams of cocaine, 5 grams of rock, you are put into 5 years of imprisonment. You get 5 years imprisonment. But the same 5-year imprisonment, you have to be found in possession of 500 grams of cocaine powder to be put into jail. 500 grams of cocaine powder to be put into jail versus 5 grams of rock. So guess what happened? The prison is filled with African Americans because 5 grams, they get put in prison. And 500, and if you possess 200 grams of cocaine, oh, well, it's not 500. So you don't get the 5 years. So that's the way the system, the rules can be created when we have biases, when we have hatred, when we have some things against a certain group of people, we could create rules to hurt those people. And guess what? Most of us don't know. We don't see. Nowadays, luckily, we have news. So now we can see a lot of things. But guess where the illegal immigrants are still? Some of them are still being kept in captivity in some facilities because of the current policy. So there are a lot of things that could be going on that we may not even see. And we may not even be aware of how the system can be created. So we have to become more aware, and we have to become more aware to see and ask questions and say, what's going on with this? Why are things like this? What happened is that we create a system that's not fair, but we may not be aware of. And the difficulty is that sometimes when we want to change the system, it requires every one of us to self-reflect. It requires us to think about the privileges that we need to give up. It requires us to think about what do we do, how do we do the right things. So for example, organic food. Organic food is much better than food that has a lot of pesticide and all that. That's bad for the environment. But organic food is expensive, right? So sometimes, doing the right thing can be expensive. Doing the right thing can cost a lot. And one example I want to give you is a lot of, I often say that I was made in Taiwan. Good quality and cheap, right? Made in Taiwan. And it's made in Taiwan. And then later on it became made in China. Later on, nowadays it becomes made in Vietnam and made in Thailand. And it's understandable that companies want to find cheaper laborers in other countries. But what we don't see here that I saw when I was living in Taiwan is when the companies came to Taiwan to build factories, because there were not a lot of laws against pollution. And so oftentimes they created pollution and they did not clean up. So we had 9 major rivers. They were clean before they came. By the time 20, 30 years later, the companies moved to Vietnam or China, all the rivers in Taiwan were polluted. And there's a social cost to it. The question is, who is paying the cost? While we may buy cheaper products here, we may end up paying for stuff later on. Somebody else has to pay for the cost of the unfair social system. And so what are the Christian principles that guide us to address social evil? The first principle is Jubilee. Have you heard of Jubilee? Jubilee actually is recorded in the Old Testament. It's a forgiveness of debts every 50 years. Forgiveness of debts every 50 years. Because they know that when the poor have to borrow money over and over, it just puts them further in debt. And so there's a law in the Bible that says that those people in power, the countries, every 50 years, all the debts should be forgiven so that the poor has a chance to start over. So that's one biblical principle. Now, the Catholic principle against the social sin is preferential treatment of the poor, right? That instead of, letting them, survival of the fittest, instead of letting people fend for themselves, we want to reach out. We want to think about the needs. We want to empower, like Jesus did, empower those who are on the who are outcast of the society. And then when it comes to a culture of excess, we are a culture of too much. The principle is to live simply. The principle by Ignatius is about active indifference. It's about not being too attached to our properties and what we own. And when it comes to having power over people, the world, the model of the world is to have power over people. Instead of power over people, what Jesus demonstrated was power for people. What Jesus demonstrated was servant leadership, which is to use our power to serve others versus to use our power to hurt others. And so what do we do with hurt people? Hurt people. What do we do with people who inflict pain on other people? Father talk about forgiveness. The most beautiful forgiveness I've heard was in South Africa when the apartheid was banished, and Nelson Mandela, he called for forgiveness. But what they did with forgiveness is, what they did was that they held public hearing. Every family that was hurt by apartheid, by the social injustice, got to come forward to talk about how they were hurt, the people that were killed. So, like Father said, forgiveness, before forgiveness, the wrongs have to be named. The wrongs have to be named so that they can be corrected. So whenever we say, oh, we forgive, now that's cheap forgiveness. Forgiveness there are 8 steps to forgiveness. It's a long work. But one of the important steps is naming the wrong. When we name the wrong, then we can say, then I forgive. If we don't name the wrong, then the wrong has not been witnessed. And the process of forgiveness is not complete. So South Africa, they didn't exercise the forgiveness until over a year later. The court hearing, every day, people come forward to talk about the wrongs that have been committed. And over a year later, then the country pronounced forgiveness after the sins have been heard. So one last thing, so for us, we are just small people. We are not big people. We are not big people with a lot of power. And sometimes we can feel very, very powerless. Sometimes we can feel very powerless against the social sin. So I always look back again to Jesus' world. All Jesus did was Jesus, 12 disciples, and Jesus did ministry 3 years. And he changed the world. Of course, it took hundreds of years. But that is our faith, right? Our faith, what Jesus talked about is the power of salt, power of the mustard seed. What is the power of salt? How much salt do we need to make a pot of soup delicious? Just a little bit of salt. And what does it mean that Jesus says salt that loses flavor? Salt that loses flavor is the groupthink. It's when we are in group and we become silent. That's salt that loses flavor. But becoming salt is to believe in the power of love, is to believe in the power of living out of our value, one person at a time. And it takes a lot of courage. And believing in the power of the mustard seed is to believe that when each of us continues to live with a value to love and with a value, Christian values, that we could change the world. That is the belief and the faith of the Christian world. Each of us doing our own part. So that's it for now. Thank you.